Hello, I'm Mark Payne of the West Virginia Humanities Council. Welcome to History Alive. History Alive is a program of the Humanities Council that brings historical figures to life through portrayals by presenters who have conducted thorough research into their character. These presentations are both entertaining and educational. The Humanities Council makes these characters available to nonprofit organizations across West Virginia, such as schools, libraries, historical societies, and a wide range of community groups. Their presentation fee is paid by the Council, and we ask only that their travel costs be covered by the host group. History Alive is designed as an interactive experience between the character and the audience. We encourage your organization or school to host a presentation and bring a figure from history for a visit with your audience or students. Having someone like Harriet Tubman or Stonewall Jackson come to speak to your group can breathe life into these historical figures. Nothing compares to the live, in-person visit. Each presentation consists of 3 parts: a monologue, a question-answer session with the character, and then the presenter breaks character to answer questions about how he or she conducted their research. Our History Live presenters have researched a variety of sources such as diaries, journals, letters, official documents, autobiographies, and the research of other scholars in developing their character. A History Live presentation is not a play. It is an audience participation event that relies on interaction between the audience and the character. Being able to ask your own questions of these important figures from the past is a unique experience. It's difficult to reproduce the feel of an actual History Live presentation here in the studio. Without an audience to ask questions, we will change the format a bit and have our guests sit with me for a few questions after the monologue. But we hope to give a sample of how a History Live presentation can add to the offerings at your school or organization. There will be information on the screen at the end of the program for how to contact the Humanities Council about bringing a History Live character to your community. At this time, I would like to welcome today's guest from history. We are pleased to have with us in the studio David Hunter Strother, aka Port Crayon.
Good afternoon. I'm always mightily pleased to receive an invitation to speak to a group in the lovely Kanawha Valley. Earlier this year, we have reached the year 1877, I served for a short time as editor of the West Virginia Herald. Now at that time and continuing now, we were embroiled in one of those periodic controversies over whether the capital should remain here in the Kanawha Valley at the city of Charleston, or whether it should return on northward to Wheeling. At the time, I broached an idea which has not been acted upon by the legislature. I suggested that the state should lease the steamer Mountain Boy, which regularly plied the waters of the Kanawha River, and build thereupon a pasteboard capital, which could then peregrinate about the waters of the state to suit the whims of the legislators. As I have said, my suggestion was not acted upon. Such is the fate of those who take it upon themselves to suggest government actions. Now, as some of you may know, during the late period of poor relations between the northern and southern sections of our fair country, I served the forces of the Union as a topographic mapper. I have taken the liberty today of bringing with me some sketches that I prepared, including an enlargement of a map I made during the war. A few features on this map I would like to point out to you. We have here the widow Amblers and the widow Barber. Widow is a title which became all too common during the war years and of course persists to this day. You may also notice that it says this is of the vicinity of Liberty Mills, that is east of the Blue Ridge Mountains. And it was drawn from information obtained from persons who were lately resident in that neighborhood. I could not go to Liberty Mills myself to make this sketch. It was behind the rebel lines. If I had gone there in uniform, I undoubtedly would have been captured. And if I had gone without uniform, if I had been caught, I likely would have been executed as a spy. So in many occasions, we had to get information from sources as best we could who had information based upon their knowledge prior to the war. On occasion, some of the best sources of that information were either freed blacks or slaves. Surprisingly enough, the freed blacks and slaves were allowed remarkable freedom of movement and were even on occasion allowed to pass through the lines of both armies. And the Southern aristocracy had a tendency to view the black man as though he were a domestic animal or perhaps a piece of furniture. You may notice in my sketch the aristocrats with a glass of wine, perhaps discussing plans for actions by the Confederacy, paying no attention to the look of interest on the obviously intelligent man's face. In my own experience, when we were stationed at Charlestown early in the war, we needed information regarding the disposition of the Confederate troops around Winchester. I recruited a slave to obtain that information for us. He was at first reluctant, but we had a powerful inducement to offer. We told him if he would obtain the information we required, we would grant him his freedom. He still was somewhat reluctant, but then we added that if he went on the mission, not only would we grant his freedom, but also we would grant freedom to his wife and children. His response then was that even if he were killed on the mission, as long as his family would receive their freedom, he would consider it to be a satisfactory result. Now, backing up a few years before the war, I had the opportunity to be present at the very tail end of John Brown's raid upon Harper's Ferry. I had the opportunity to sketch him while he was being interrogated by Governor Henry Wise. I also visited him in his jail cell and was able to be present for much of the trial and also for the execution. Now, very few civilians were allowed to witness the execution, but since my uncle, Andrew Hunter, was a special prosecutor for the Commonwealth of Virginia, I was able to obtain access. Now, John Brown himself, who we see here on the gallows, with the jailer and the sheriff preparing him for the trapdoor to fall, I recall having described at the time as a greasy old thief. And my opinion has not changed. And he certainly was a madman, but a brave madman nevertheless. When he was asked if he wanted to be given a handkerchief to drop as a signal for them to drop the trap, he responded, "No, I do not wish you to keep me waiting unnecessarily." Now, when the war began, neither I nor any of the other officers and men of the Union forces, or at least very few of them, would have said that the purpose of the war was to free the slaves. We were fighting to preserve the Union. However, there was one group of people who clearly recognized that regardless of what the goal of the war was, the outcome would be, inevitably, freedom for the slaves. And the group that recognized this was the slaves themselves. Here we have a sketch I made of a family of slaves splashing through the waters of the Potomac River, heading for the safety of the Union lines on the North Shore. For even though Maryland was a slave-holding state, it remained loyal to the Union. Certainly, John Brown was a madman, but just a few days over 6 years from the time of his execution, with the passage of the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, all the slaves were free. So who is to say which was the greater madness, that of John Brown or that of the secessionists, who saw their beloved Commonwealth of Virginia and many of their own homes lying in ruins? Now, during the war, the soldiers on both sides endured many privations, but I must admit, those of the Confederacy were much more deprived than those of us in the Union. We generally had sufficient food and sufficient clothing. You'll see here this soldier binding his feet. These are stragglers behind the rebel army. They are not straggling because they are lazy or attempting to shirk their duties. They are tired. They are hungry. Their feet are bleeding. In the sketch, you cannot see the crimson of the rags being wrapped around their feet from the blood flowing from the cracks in their soles. And of course, they are eating field corn, a food which is better fit for animals than for people. Now, during the war, any soldier will tell you, you have periods of terror, punctuated by long periods in camp. Many of the men whiled away those hours with cards and whiskey when they could be obtained. Having been an artist before the war, I was able to make more productive use of my time. I have here a sketch I made of apparatuses which could be used for reconnaissance work for mapping the positions and fortifications of the enemy. The extender chair device you see here, I presented to the Quartermaster Corps, but after consulting with them, they decided that regardless of how stout the trooper operating the mechanism, or how light the drummer boy occupying the observer's chair, the device simply would not be stable. However, we did make use of observation balloons. Now, I have not included in my sketch the rope which tethered the balloon to the ground, but we did make many valuable observations and sketch some maps from the vantage point offered by the balloons. I recall an old chum of mine from my days in General McClellan's Topographic Corps, a young lieutenant some of you may have heard of. He was named George Armstrong Custer. Lieutenant Custer was ordered to go aloft in the observation balloon and take the observations. Now, we all know Lieutenant Custer feared no man, white, red, or black, but to send him soaring into the sky, suspended beneath an envelope of hydrogen gas, was another matter entirely. And he reported last year, shortly before his death, that as the balloon arose and the aeronaut invited him to stand in the basket, that he declined to do so. And when the aeronaut jumped up and down in the basket to demonstrate its strength, Lieutenant Custer found himself crouching in the basket, gripping the sides, and perhaps trembling like a frightened child. Now, despite the somewhat tragic nature of Colonel Custer's recent demise at the hands of Crazy Horse and his cohorts, I still find that tale mildly amusing. After the war, I was pleased to have the opportunity to return to my literary and artistic careers, visiting in the mountains. I and the others of the groups that visited relished the opportunity to visit those areas before civilization penetrated there. There are still many who wish that we could civilize the beast of the forest just the same as the people. And we would have Mama Bear, perhaps reading one of my own articles in Harper's Magazine, and Papa Bear, literally bringing home the bacon. And any of you who have visited in the mountains know the manners of the people in the mountains are not always refined. I made this sketch when visiting the family of Washington Roy on the Dry Fork of Cheat River. As you can see, Mrs. Roy, when the baby needs fed, is not shy about doing so. And some of the children have not necessarily been taught the manners that would be appropriate in front of company. But they are pleasant and good people nevertheless. And those people do know how to enjoy themselves. Indeed, dances with fiddlers and other musicians are common in the mountains and are a way that the people can punctuate their hard existence with a little frivolity and fun. And of course, it is not just the people of the mountains who can dance. Now, I did not witness this scene myself. It was described to me by an old mountaineer from Webster County by the name of Jim Cole. He'd been troubled by the bears raiding his beehives, so he had used a tub of apple jack, some of you may know it as brandy, to bait the bears into a pen. When he arrived the next day, he decided that he had perhaps been a bit too generous with the bait. As you can see, young bears, just as young humans, have no fear of climbing and are certain they cannot be injured. And while the others are enjoying themselves, perhaps reminiscing about old times, one who has had perhaps a bit too much is sleeping off the effects. I trust that none of you have ever found yourselves in a similar situation. But one of the best parts of having the opportunity to return to the mountains and visit with the people and the places there is the chance to interact with those proud people who call themselves West Virginia Mountaineers. But of course, as with any old soldier, when the war is over, the best part is the chance to return home. In my own case, it was the opportunity to get back to our pleasant little cottage in Berkeley Springs, where the newspaper enters but once a week, the telegram is unknown, and Anna is spelled with a U.
I'm here with David Hunter Strother, and I want to thank you very much for taking time out of your schedule to be with us here today.
My pleasure.
I want to start by asking you, if you would, to please tell me a little bit about what it was like when you were growing up in Martinsburg and Berkeley Springs. What were your early days like?
Well, the time was spent partially in Martinsburg, partially in Berkeley Springs, where my father had a resort hotel, and also other places in that area. It was a somewhat large extended family. I was somewhat of a sickly and frail child. In fact, my sister Emily and I are the only 2 of 10 children who survived. And I believe my mother was somewhat protective of me. I had a serious illness at the age of 10, which nearly killed me. And after that, discovered a newfound vigor and just loved to roam the woods and the fields, and became quite an adventurous child.
Well, when did you first become interested in art?
Well, initially, I wished to embark upon a military career, and in fact had sought an appointment to West Point. But when I learned that I would not be able to receive that appointment because my father was of the wrong political persuasion, I decided to search for other avenues of expression. And I trained as an artist in New York City with some fairly well-known artists of the day, and eventually trained in Paris and Rome as a portraitist and landscape artist. Then returned to this country and tried to make a career as a portrait artist in the Ohio Valley, and there is a reason for the term starving artist.
So when did you come up with the pen name of Port Crayon?
Well, when I began my writing career for Harper's, I had already been doing some illustration work, and they invited me to write some stories to accompany my illustrations. And generally speaking, a gentleman does not write over their real name. They adopt a nom de plume. It allows a little more freedom in the writing. A porte crayon is a French writing instrument. It is a metal shaft with the ends split, and into each of those split ends a pencil lead is inserted and then clamped in place by a sliding metal ring. You can use a different consistency of lead on each end. It is a common implement used by sketch artists.
So now, once the war broke out, you sided with the Union, and I'm just curious, how did that set with your family, friends, and neighbors up in the Martinsburg area?
Well, there were many in the family and also amongst friends who presumed that I would go with the forces of rebellion. In fact, many of them owned slaves themselves. But my father himself was a strong Unionist, being a veteran of the War of 1812. And anyone who thought that I would support secession had simply not paid attention to what I had written and said in the years before the war. I strongly believed in preservation of the Union, although I certainly believed that abolition was its own form of madness, just as secession was.
Did your position and or your family's position cause any hardship for you at home?
There are rifts in the family which continue to this day. My uncle Andrew Hunter, who was the special prosecutor at the Brown trial, was a strong secessionist, and eventually his home was lost during the war to the forces of the Union. It was destroyed, and he has not yet chosen to speak to me, although I certainly hope that we may yet be reconciled.
I'm glad you mentioned John Brown, because you were one of the very few journalists allowed at the execution. And you also, I know when you were speaking earlier, mentioned that you actually visited John Brown in his cell before his execution. I want to ask you, what were your impressions of John Brown, the man, at that time?
Well, certainly the same as much of the public had the impression. He was certainly a madman, somewhat of a bloodthirsty character, but very dedicated to his cause. And he did believe that if it was necessary for blood to be shed to purge the nation of the sin of slavery, that he was willing to have his blood be the first that was shed. And even though his madness was somewhat maddening, shall I say, he was very dedicated to his cause.
Mm-hmm. So at his execution, I'm sure that was a very solemn occasion. What's your lasting remembrance of that event?
The event itself was very solemn and quiet. Of course, there were troops standing guard. Very few reporters were present. A few had joined Virginia militia units to gain access to the execution. But in general, it was feared that the forces of abolition may attempt to interrupt the execution, so they were carefully guarded against. My lasting impression, as the trap door was dropped beneath John Brown's feet, was I gazed out across the same landscape from the outskirts of Charlestown toward Harper's Ferry, over a lovely pastoral scene, and noted that the last sight that John Brown witnessed on this earth was that lovely and very serene view.
Well, at this time, I'd just like to point out that this isn't really David Hunter Strother. This is actually Don Teeter of Montreville. Don is one of our new presenters on our History Live roster, and Don, I appreciate you being here with us today. Thanks for taking time out of your schedule. And I want to ask you what I ask all of our presenters. What was it about Port Crayon, or David Hunter Strother, I always want to say Strother. I think I've said it both ways on here today, but you can maybe start by straightening us out on that. But
actually, I have done the same and have settled on the pronunciation Strother because I consulted with Hunter Lesser, who is quite the expert on the first campaign of the Civil War and has personal acquaintance with some of the descendants. And I'm copying the pronunciation from what he said the family members had used. I first discovered the character back in 1976 when I was researching and writing a history of the Dry Fork area of Randolph and Tucker counties, and read some of the things he had written, but they were not what I was looking for at the time. I was searching for hard documentary history. I realize now they would have been a great addition to.
And you're a surveyor.
My day job is as a land surveyor. I rediscovered the character about 8 or 9 years ago when I was developing a continuing education seminar for surveyors on surveying and map making in the Civil War. And because of his service as a topographer during the war, I had the opportunity to come across him again and had the interest rekindled then. And a couple of years ago then, when the Humanities Council put out a call for characters related to the Civil War and the formation of West Virginia, the dormant embers of that interest were rekindled and have led to the full flame of this character.
Well, good, and we're very glad that it did, because I've personally always felt that Strother is one of the most interesting characters in West Virginia history for sure, and is certainly worthy of more people knowing more about him. He had such a diverse career. Tell us a little bit about what he did after the Civil War.
Well, he initially served a short stint as Adjutant General of the restored government of Virginia, and in that capacity actually helped to secure funding to restore the Virginia Military Institute, which had been burned during General David Hunter's campaign in the Shenandoah Valley in 1864. They were distant cousins. There are some people who confuse the two with each other. And he decided that he was not going to be very successful in that position because of animosities which had carried over from the war, so returned to his career as a writer and artist. It was not quite as financially rewarding because Harper's Magazine had lost its Southern readership in the years afterward. And he also struggled to pay off the debts which had been left to him and his sister by their father.
So if someone wants to learn more about David Hunter Strother, what were some of the sources that you went to develop your character?
Well, a book that was published by the WVU Press sometime within the last 10 or 12 years. John Cuthbert was one of the authors of that book. It's David Hunter Strother, one of the best draftsmen the country possesses. It has some biographical information, but also a good collection of his sketches and artwork. A biography by Cecil Eby was published back in the 60s, was really quite the definitive work. He had access to the family and to the family's papers. But of course, the most voluminous and interesting source, the primary material, is the literally thousands of pages of published material that Strother wrote, both over his nom de plume of Port Crayon and also with his real name. In general, I have concluded that when he signed something as David Strother, he looked at himself as being a reporter. When he used the pen name, he had a little more literary freedom to develop the stories.
Yeah. Well, here in the last minute that we have here, tell us about the circumstances of his death, where his final resting place is.
He had just returned from a trip to the eastern shore of Maryland with his son John, who was attempting to begin a career as a writer, but who had been trained as an engineer. And on their return...
And they were returning to...
They were returning to the eastern panhandle, to the area around Charlestown, Martinsburg. And he had an office in that area and was preparing to resume his own literary career after his son had been called to a job for a railroad, and developed pneumonia. And pneumonia was not the treatable disease it is now. And in 1888, after a week of illness, succumbed to pneumonia.
Okay. I want to thank Don Teeter of Monterville for being here with us today, and thank you for joining us with History Alive.